Good evening, everybody. It's great to see y'all. Very excited to hear from Dr. Karen Long-Traynor tonight, a clinical psychologist who is working in New Jersey at the Rutgers Cancer Institute. She's going to be sharing some of that information that we all are constantly asking about how we really take care of these mesh, the mental, emotional, and social health factors for our campers and our staff. I mean, let's face it, it's really the whole camp community that we have to think about these things for. So you didn't log in to listen to me talk tonight, though. I just want to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Long-Traynor. Thank you for being with us, and we are excited to hear what you have to share.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. Let me share my screen. Hold on. So I am a clinical psychologist working in a pediatric cancer center. My main role is clinical, but I do dabble in some research on the side. So I am working on a daily basis with kids and their siblings and parents as they are going through their cancer journey, both in the hospital and in clinic and even into survivorship. And I wanted to talk to you today about the psychological and emotional impact of pediatric cancer. I'll talk a little bit about how to address some of the factors that come up, or if you see some of these issues come up, but just knowing some of the struggles and being cognizant of it is, I think, in and of itself, a really helpful thing. Just to be able to nod and show understanding when a kid might be going through some sort of struggle is almost more important than having some sort of formal intervention, just giving them that understanding. So first off, I want to start with the good news, is that the vast majority of kids who go through cancer do just fine. They don't come out with these long-lasting psychological scars. The majority of them are happy and well-functioning individuals who go on to lead successful and happy lives. In fact, there is some research that shows that kids who are going through cancer are psychologically healthier than the average population. One of the factors related to that is something called post-traumatic growth. And we hear a whole lot about trauma and how trauma impacts kids and can have lasting negative impact. But just because somebody goes through a trauma does not mean that they're going to be traumatized. That going through trauma can actually have some pretty amazing silver linings. That after living with cancer, some of survivors, some of the kids going through treatment, their family members find that they have grown psychologically and have some very beneficial changes in how they view themselves, the types of relationships that they have. They may have a stronger quality of relationship with others as opposed to superficial ones or being focused on things that aren't so important. All right, with that being said, there's a really big but. So even though most kids do fine, there is a significant, about 25 to 35% of kids going through cancer who show significant psychological distress. And this distress can be anything from anxiety, worry, behavioral acting out, sadness, depression. Some of them do have post-traumatic stress. But even if kids are adjusting just fine, there are some very unique factors in coping with cancer that they need to figure out how to adjust to. When kids are first diagnosed with cancer, their oncology group, their oncology providers typically give them a roadmap, which is basically the game plan for what treatment is going to look like. When they're going to come into the hospital and clinic for various treatments, the types of chemos or radiation or surgery that they're going to have. And unfortunately, on the psychosocial side of things, we can't give families a roadmap of what to expect and what it's going to be like for them. that adjustment to cancer is incredibly variable, and it's influenced by personality of the kids, of the family, prior experiences that they've had, the family and cultural factors, and coping can really change at different points in treatment. Some families and kids breeze through this whole thing like it's no big deal. They continue to show a lot of energy and optimism and hope and are really able to stay engaged in their lives. And it's like easy peasy, they're through it. Some kids and families may adjust pretty well in the beginning, and then something happens. And it may not be a really big thing, but it is that thing that is the tipping point. And now they are experiencing heightened levels of distress, and it's much harder for them. The most common path is that the first 1 to 3 months will be psychologically challenging, and then kids and families return to their baseline level of functioning. But you can't always predict how they're going to react. So I'd like to talk about some variables that are pretty common that cause distress in kids. These are things that can lead to significant clinical distress, or they're just stuff that the kids and the families have to figure out how to deal with. I'm going to talk about 3 different time points: the initial adjustment to treatment, the long haul middle of it, of the vast majority of treatment, and then a little bit about into survivorship. So when a kid is first diagnosed, there is the most concrete and obvious: they have to cope with being physically sick. That for a lot of our kids, they are previously healthy, and they haven't had to cope with any sort of serious illness or any sort of prolonged hospitalization. Most of them maybe had a flu or strep throat or something like that, where they were in the bed for a couple of days, but then they felt better and they were out back into school and out and about and doing their thing. So for possibly the first time, our kids and families are having to face some pretty scary and distressing procedures that they may have to face. Not only being told you have cancer, but then you have to face going into surgery for a potential biopsy, having a big old needle shoved in your back. Even though it's not painful, going for MRIs and different scans can be incredibly overwhelming and stressful for kids. Kids have to cope with the side effects. So they are feeling nauseous and they're vomiting and experiencing pain. And most kids have experienced nausea and pain, but it goes away after a day. They're not stuck with it day after day after day and wondering how they're going to deal with this and what life is going to be like. One of the things that impacts how well a kid is going to adjust to treatment is, to an extent, how well they can put up with a bit of discomfort. So if they have the idea that when you're sick, you stay in bed and you stay there, or you lie low and you're really mellow until you feel better, and then you go about your life again, they're not going to do so well. Because now all of a sudden that rule of stay in bed till you're healthy and stay away from family and friends and school until you're healthy no longer applies. Having a bit of chicken soup isn't going to fix it the way that things might have in the past. There are some chemotherapies that they get in the hospital that are pretty intense, and they're not allowed to leave until all of that chemo is flushed out of their system. One of the ways that they help get that flush going is to physically walk around and move and get their body going. But they're not feeling very well. So if the kid has the idea that they can't get out of bed until they feel okay, they're going to have a hard time getting out of the hospital, and there can be some other sorts of prolonged adjustment issues down the road. So in addition to dealing with the physical impact of disease, they have to deal with the emotion of having something really significant. And Not surprisingly, there can be a lot of fear in the beginning. And you might think that a lot of it is the fear of death, but that really, especially with kids, is not the most significant one. It is much more the fear of the unknown. Um, kids are used to having a routine, that they go to school, they have dinner at a certain time, or just whatever their routine is. And that routine brings a sense of safety and security. And when that is completely disrupted and they no longer know what's going to happen next week or even tomorrow, it really can bring a lot of distress. One of the things that I hear a lot is that fear of prolonged treatment, not so much death, but having to go through treatment. Even if it is a 5-month treatment or a 2-year treatment, that is a significant amount of time to a little kid, or to even to a teenager. For an adult, 6 months is like, 6 months, you can get through this, it's not a big deal. For a kid, 6 months is forever. They are having to cope with separation from family and friends, especially during times of COVID. They might have been away from siblings and a lot of family members for months at a time. And that isolation is a really big deal. It is pretty common for kids of all ages to emotionally regress. And what I mean by this is that all of a sudden a kid is going to start to act maybe a year or two before, or in a previous developmental stage. So you might get a school-age kid who all of a sudden is really wanting mom and dad to stay in their hospital bed with them and sleep with them. At home, a lot of times kids are now sleeping in their parents' beds after they've been sleeping on their own for years. You might see a little kid that now wants to sleep with that teddy bear that they hadn't had in a really long time. They might want to sleep with the light on when they had really gotten past that stage. Teenagers do this too. Teenagers seem to vacillate a little bit more between extremes. So on one hand, they might really want mom and dad in their life more than they did before. They want mom and dad to start making more decisions for them, to make everything better like they did when they were a little kid. And then they vacillate to the other side of wanting that independence, which is typically what teenagers are supposed to be doing. That desire to go back to have mom and dad make decisions for them is really a divergence from what is expected for that developmental age. So they kind of go back and forth between these extremes. To complicate things a little bit, there can be a lot of guilt in adolescence for wanting to continue to be independent. You might think that they'd be mad that all of a sudden mom and dad have basically moved into their room. So in the hospital, they're all in the same space. They have no privacy. They've got their independence has been taken away. But what we see more often is this internal struggle of them kind of wanting it, them kind of wanting to be a little kid again where they're taken care of, and feeling some guilt when they want to have their alone time because they see how much their parents are doing for them and wanting to protect them. So these kids are faced with a lot of external changes, some pretty significant life changes, and that in and of itself is going to cause a lot of emotional distress. Now you add in the artificial change in mood based on medications. Steroids is a really big culprit with this. You hear about roid rage with bodybuilders. Well, our kids get it too. So throughout their lives, they've learned what it feels like to be irritable or angry or happy or sad and all of these things. And they've basically learned, some better than others, how to cope with that and how to react to it. Perhaps some of the things that are going to trigger some of those moods. Now, all of a sudden, we have pumped their bodies through all sorts of chemicals that are physically altering their mood. And for the first time, these kids are having to experience these really big feelings of anger and irritability that they probably don't understand and don't know how to deal with. while intellectually parents and especially older kids can understand that medications can impact mood, in the day-to-day reality, it's kind of hard for them to wrap their head around it. The other day I was talking to a mom who her kid is about 6 months into it, ALL, so a very heavy course of steroids. And this kid before was super sweet, and he's still super sweet, but a kid who was very polite and compliant and never talked back and was such an easy kid and did everything that he said and watched out for his little sisters. 6 weeks into it, all of a sudden um, he is irritable. He's snapping at his parents. He is much less compliant and refusing to do some of his chores. He is not wanting anything to do with his little sister. And his mom was almost in tears. She's like, what is going on with my kid? Where did my kid go? And what did I do wrong? Why is he acting like this? And while she could understand that a lot of this is related to steroids and really and a very typical adjustment to the early phases of treatment, it was hard for her to emotionally understand it. Just as an aside, she was also quite worried about what other people were going to think of her. I really feel for parents. I call it parenting in a fishbowl. All of a sudden, their kids are not at their best, and all these people are watching what they're doing. They are never by themselves, hospital staff everywhere. Another issue that comes up is medication refusal. And I'm using that quite lightly because they're not really refusing it. They're just being difficult about taking medications. And there is the very real and concrete explanation of this, of medication is no fun. Some of those pills are huge and are hard to get down. Some of them taste disgusting, and that taste doesn't necessarily go away right away. You can maybe chase it with some juice, but it's still there. It's really gross. Kids, even little ones, learn really quick that these medications make them feel bad. So who wants to take them? And that is, I think that in and of itself is quite understandable. But there can be another layer that goes on there. And this one I think is a little bit more unconscious or out of awareness, but it has to do with an issue of control. So in general, kids have very little control over their environment, especially the young ones, that their parents make all the decisions, keep them safe, give them food. They are completely dependent on them. Even teenagers, while they like to think that they are independent in making decisions for themselves, they're not. They're also really dependent on their parents. It's one of the reasons that little kids really gravitate towards superheroes, and that in their imagination, in their daydreams, they can be these all-powerful beings. And especially when the superheroes are kids, it can be such a great fantasy imagination for them to be able to have that control. So some of this medication refusal is about, I'm not taking my medication. I have that choice. Oh, okay, I agree. I'm going to take that medication now. Now it's again my choice. Obviously, kids need to take it, and we can't feed into them doing this a lot, but I think it's also really important to understand that there are a lot of factors that go into that. Very recently, I had a 12-year-old who also leukemia, and she unfortunately has had some pretty significant medical complications and had 3 weeks of hell, really, just stuck in the hospital and not doing well. Everything resolved. She went back home. She had to continue with her at-home chemo. And one day she broke down crying and said, I'm not doing this anymore. I am not taking my medication. I am not doing treatment. I'm stopping. And of course, her mother was really upset by this, because the mother heard, I'm not going to do medication anymore. I'm going to die, and I'm suicidal. But it really wasn't that. It was, she was expressing that she was completely overwhelmed and having a really hard time with it, and really wish to have a bit of control. It is common to hear kids say that they're going to stop treatment. It is rare, incredibly rare, I've never actually seen it, where they try to actually do it. It's much more of an expression of this is hard than I'm suicidal or I want to die. All right, after the initial couple months of treatment, again, maybe 1 to 3 months, the kids and families start to settle in. They get used to the new routines of going to the hospital or going to clinic or radiation or whatever they need. They get used to routines of taking medications. They know a little bit of what to expect as far as side effects and hospital life and all of that. However, treatment is a long haul. That whether it is 6 to 9 months or whether it's 2 to 3 years, these kids no longer have a typical life. Their developmental trajectory, the way that typical kids develop based on their experiences, it is altered because their experiences are so different than that of their peers. There are 2 main developmental tasks that I want to talk about. One of them is school and the other is socialization. So as far as school goes, cancer and treatment disrupted. There is absolutely no way around that. From a psychosocial perspective, it is really important for kids to get back into school in person. They learn better. There's social aspect to school. Overall, it is something that we encourage and really strive for. In order to help them get back into school, we will work with schools and help establish something called a 504 plan. For those of you who aren't as familiar with it, it falls under the Americans with Disability Act. Cancer is considered a disability, and it requires that schools or jobs or what have you provide reasonable accommodations. The type of accommodations that we typically request for our kids are things like not being penalized for absences, having extended time to complete homework. Sometimes we'll ask for a reduced workload, hopefully get rid of some of that busy work so they don't have to do so much of that. They may get out of gym class or have an elevator pass, those types of things. But even with these accommodations, kids fall behind. That they are missing class because of they might be in the hospital or have a clinic visit or just really not feeling well. And even though they're given extra time to complete that work, they have to do that along with their regular work when they're possibly not feeling good. They might be experiencing side effects. They might have that very real chemo fog where it's hard to focus and concentrate. They might be experiencing some pretty significant fatigue from chemo or radiation or what have you. And it makes it quite challenging to keep up. When you add in existing learning problems or pre-existing learning problems, it makes it extra challenging. On the other side of things, if you have a kid who is academically advanced, it can be a real hit to their self-esteem to not be performing at the level that they were performing before. A lot of those kids can be pretty competitive also, so when they're falling behind in rank, it's challenging. And while we really advocate for kids to be in school, there are times that kids are not medically healthy enough and they need to stay home. In New Jersey, it's called getting home instruction. I think the name may vary from state to state, but what it is getting 1 hour per day of one-on-one instruction from a teacher, 1 hour. In the past, this was always in person. Nowadays, sometimes it's virtual. And while this meets the school requirements, as you can imagine, you can't get a whole lot from 1 hour a day. It is significantly less academically challenging than it would be if they were in school full time. And even in home instruction, kids still fall behind because they may have to cancel one of those 1 hour sessions because of, again, being in the hospital or clinic visits. They might be thrown up and they can't do the visit that day. So all of a sudden, instead of getting 5 hours a week, they're getting 2, and they can fall behind. Unfortunately, one of the long-term effects of going through childhood cancer is that a significant subportion experience difficulties with employment, and that is very much related to these school issues. Social development is another major task during school age and teenage years. This is really where they learn how to interact with other people. They learn the type of jokes that are appropriate and the ones that are really crossing the line. They're learning about social problem solving. What do you do when you get in a disagreement with somebody? How to work in groups and problem solve, all of those different types of things. And again, cancer and treatment come in and muck up that also. For younger kids, the main source of social interaction is at school. They may have siblings at home, but it's different. So when they are unable to go to school or there's disruption in their school, it really disrupts their social interaction and social development. Teenagers have a bit more control in maintaining their friendships. They can text and FaceTime and social media. No phone calls, because of course teenagers will not talk on the phone. But they can, to an extent, keep those relationships going. But they also are missing out on a lot of the social interactions and the in-person interactions. And those can have a cumulative effect over time. So they might miss out on some of the big things like a prom or different parties or activities, but even missing out on those day-to-day conversations at lunch or recess or after school really have a cumulative effect of having less experience. And over time, these kids can really feel like they are on the outside looking in on their friend group. Research shows that majority of peers see kids with cancer quite favorably. They treat them well, they like them. Sometimes they rate them as more popular as other kids in the class. But they still have very different experiences. And that different life experience, not having that shared experience, makes it harder for them to relate to each other on a deeper level. It makes it harder for them to pick up on those subtleties of social development and social interaction. Little kids, teenagers are pretty self-focused, which is that's the way they're supposed to be. That is completely developmentally appropriate. And what is more important to them is their own perception of how people see them, as opposed to the feedback that they actually get. So while they might be accepted by their peers, if they feel different, that is going to be much more significant and make them feel isolated and awkward and not part of the crowd. I was talking to a survivor the other day, and she's a bit older. She's in college now, and some of her college friends were reminiscing about high school and all of the parties that they went to and who was dating who, and all of the laughing about some of the different dramas and how different colleges and that kind of stuff. And she was, participating and hanging out, but in the back of her mind, she's like, yeah, well, I didn't go to prom because I was in the hospital. I was the bald kid, and while everyone was nice to me, there weren't people lining up to take me out on dates. And her experience was very different than theirs. Related to this, there are potentially a lot of body issues. That hair loss is a really big deal, not only to girls, but to boys. There can be a lot of physical changes, such as scarring, a lot of weight gain. Steroids can make you puffy. You can gain weight over the course of treatment. There might be some, you might walk funny because of neuropathy or drop foot or other sorts of things, and it just contributes to having a hard time getting to have those connections with other people. This one is a little kind of off the path, but I think it's interesting and important to mention. This one is more relevant to the adolescents and the young adults, but there is something about cancer that seems to give people permission to be incredibly intrusive and really dogmatic about how intrusive they are. And some of the common ways that this happens is through advice about food. Is a huge one. Tons of advice about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, and about alternate therapies for cancer. And while some teens and young adults can laugh this off or roll with it, there are a lot of them that really struggle with how to deal with this and feel quite awkward and different. All right, what about COVID? How is this impacting our kids and coping? So like everything else, the impact is highly variable. There is obviously, without a doubt, some pretty big negatives that come with COVID, but there's also some neutral and silver linings that go along with it. The main negative is the increase in isolation. Kids with cancer are already experiencing isolation, and this just really heightened it. So especially because of changes in visitation, kids in the hospital and the clinic they're just with one parent. Sometimes they don't see their siblings for months at a time. And for kids that are close with their siblings, that really rely on them, this is a really big deal. Big deal to the siblings also. There's a dramatic change in the environment of the hospital. So before, the hospital and clinic was a fairly vibrant place. There would be a lot of people. There would be family and friends. Groups of kids would come together to do art projects or groups or hang out. A lot of volunteers would come through. In our hospital, the college kids would come through and be a buddy to the kids. We'd have firemen come through. There'd be superheroes, different proms and events, and things that would make the hospital an interesting place and offset some of the downsides and the pain and all of that go along with it. In the past, when I've talked to survivors, especially when they went through treatment when they were a bit younger, like 6, 7, 8, they wouldn't really remember the bad stuff about cancer. They would remember all the activities that happened in the hospital and all the presents. They still get the presents, but they don't get the activity. So I'm really curious about how this is going to play out in the future when kids going through cancer during the COVID era don't have these experiences to offset the discomforts of hospital life and clinic life. Not surprisingly, COVID exacerbates any sort of existing stressors. If you have an anxious family, their anxiety just kind of goes through the roof. If you have a single parent who is trying to juggle kids, it's this added challenge. What do you do when you have to take your kid to clinic and you've got a 3-year-old that you're not allowed to bring with you? That already they have a whole lot of financial expenses from hospital bills. You want to add a daily babysitter or weekly babysitter on top of that? How often can you ask family or friends, if you have family or friends, to help out? And so those things would add a lot of stresses. And of course, some parents are fearful of returning to school or activities. COVID just made that all the much worse. On the bright side of things, kids would express not feeling so left out. That, if I have to go through cancer, at least nobody else is doing anything. I'm not missing out on stuff. And that was actually a really big one. And I'd had kids say, my friends don't even know that I'm not in school because everyone was virtual. And it turns out teachers weren't all that strict about having cameras on, so they wouldn't necessarily know. There's some evidence that kids and families who were sick prior to COVID were better prepared to cope with it. They already knew how to deal with isolation. They already knew how to deal with limiting the spread of disease and hygiene. And there was a little bit of a welcome to the club. And now you guys get to experience what we've gone through, and a bit of feelings of safety that all of a sudden their communities were really concerned about disease spread and hygiene. So in a weird sense, it gave them a bit more comfort. And a little bit of a double-edged sword for some, being able to work remotely in school and work in the hospital gave them a bit of relief. All right, so you come to the end of cancer and it's really exciting. You get to ring that bell and you celebrate and it's done with. And you're really excited and happy, right? So like every stage, that this one does not come without its challenges. And while this is a bit of a dramatic sentiment, one that I hear over and over again, that the stress of coming off treatment is similar to the stress of beginning it. Because all of a sudden, there is this omnipresent fear of the cancer coming back. Nearly all kids go through that, no matter what their prognosis is. And it waxes and wanes. Sometimes it's really in the forefront of their mind, sometimes not. During times of anniversaries, it may pop back up. They have to relearn how to interact with their bodies. So they go from having a normal understanding of aches and pains and fevers to, oh my God, a fever might land you in the hospital and it's the biggest deal in the world, to, all right, your fever is 99.9, no big deal, don't sweat it. Why are you so concerned? And having to readjust to that. There are continued issues with body image. There's the continued issue of the lack of shared experiences with their friends. And there is a subset of individuals, about 20 to 30% of individuals, who will have lasting significant psychological distress. And this can be in the form of anxiety, withdrawal, behavior problems, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress symptoms, as well as continued academic and social issues. So it's not all fun and games when you get into survivorship. I know we're getting kind of short on time, but just really quickly, siblings. Siblings also have their own unique challenges. It's not so easy to be to have a sibling with cancer. That their life is also incredibly interrupted. That their family routines have been shattered. Holidays, which often are really important to kids, are different. We just had Easter and Passover, and a lot of kids are in the hospital, so you don't get to have those family celebrations. Siblings are often separated from their families. So in COVID, they can't come into the hospital and be part of the process. With and without COVID, sometimes they get shipped off to grandparents or aunts and uncles, and there's just a lot of disruption. Emotionally, they can be internally pretty conflicted and have just be pulled in different types of directions. They may try to be the good kid to not add stress, or they may act out because they're not getting as much attention as they used to. There may be fear for their sibling, worry about how they're doing. There can also be some anger and jealousy, like why isn't Johnny getting in trouble for doing that? Why doesn't he have to do his chores? Why do I have to be good and he doesn't? And then some guilt for some of that stuff. So siblings go through a lot also and have a tough time. All right, so got some basic ideas of what these kids are going through and how can you help. Camp is amazing. Whenever kids come back from camp and they talk about it, their faces light up. When I talk to survivors, camp is one of the things that really sticks out as something that helped them get through this incredibly challenging situation. So I spoke a lot about that lack of shared experience. When they come to camp, they are around people who just get it. They don't have to try to explain what they're going through. So with their friends, they may try to explain, and their friends may listen and say they understand, but it's just they don't. They can say one or two sentences about an experience, and their camp friend is just going to understand. And then they can go about and play and have fun and just be kids. So this is a very normalizing and important experience for them. So thank you guys. During camp, I imagine there's going to be kids that are showing some amount of distress. And this might sound really strange coming from a psychologist, but it's not always helpful to really talk about it. That doesn't mean shut them down or change the topic or not allow them to talk about it. But what it means is following their lead. And a kid may want to say one or two sentences, and that's it. They're not looking for a deeper conversation. They're not necessarily looking for you to delve into what's going on for them. They just want to say what they have to say, know that they're feeling supported, and go about their day. There are times when they want to talk more, but what is really helpful to do is to validate their experience. That one of the things that adults, people like to do is like be positive, and it's all good, it's okay, don't worry about that, you're at camp, you don't, we're having a good time. But sometimes just acknowledging, yeah, you're going through something really hard. Just that, just listening can be really impactful. I love the young ones, and that I call it dropping a bomb. Sometimes they will say a sentence that is like, oh my God, I have to really be here and dive into this. And then they're like, they walk away and there's no big deal. Yesterday, I was in clinic and a kid came in who was a year off of therapy, and he had just gotten over a cold. And then he got really serious and he was like, yeah, when I get sick, I really think about cancer. I'm like, oh God, okay. Really got to pull this kid aside and make sure that he's doing okay. He's probably really worried about recurrence and all this stuff, and the different things that survivors may deal with. But when I asked my follow-up question, just like, oh, what were you thinking about? I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was pretty dismissive. He was like, it just reminded me. And then he shrugged his shoulders and he was back to doing something else. So what was important to him was to be able to say it, to not have it invalidated or denied, and then to be able to move on to the next thing. There, of course, are going to be kids who need professional intervention. Their cancer centers likely have a good amount of resources. And there are some really good online resources, and these are some of my favorites. That these are ones that there are ones that provide information. These particular ones provide support. Cactus Cancer Society and Elephants and Tea are really for adolescents and young adults. Momcology is a great support for, they say it's for moms and dads, but it's all their pictures and everything is really moms. I think dads get left out. And Cancer Care for Kids actually provides services for younger kids. But again, so I've talked about a lot of things that are very challenging and can set kids with cancer, can set them up for difficulties and distress. But I want to just stress that the majority of them are just fine. Even if they have these challenges, they figure out a way to have a full life and not be overburdened by the psychological factors. Sometimes when I tell people what I do, I typically try to dodge that question, but when I actually do talk about it and answer it, one of the responses that I get is, oh my God, that's so sad. How can you deal with that? But in reality, these kids are inspiring. They are so resilient and so amazing that they might be in their bed feeling sick one moment, but as soon as they feel that much better, they're out with their medicine pool, walking around, just being a kid. It is pretty inspiring. So that's what I got for you guys. Thank you. Stop.
And thank you. I know there's a question in the chat that Beverly had posted about children's books that you might recommend to give to children in treatment at different ages and to siblings. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a tough one, in that I don't, unfortunately, I keep an eye out, but I don't have any go-to children's books that I like. There is one that I like for, it's not specific to cancer, but it is, helps with attachment, which is The Invisible String. Who's it by? And it really talks about when you're not close to somebody that you are still tied to people.
Karen, I know a lot of our members are switching to family camp models for various reasons. So and I know you do a lot of work with the parents as well. So could you just very briefly kind of touch on how important it is for parents to also meet other parents?
Yes. So parents actually have a much harder time psychologically than kids do. So between 50 and 65% of parents have significant psychological distress. And if you think about it, they have to deal with their own reactions to their kid getting sick, their larger knowledge of the implications of that. They worry about death a lot more than kids do. Um, and then they have to, with all of that, help their kid get through very challenging situations. They have to watch their child vomit. They have to deal with their kid in pain. Their kid is saying, "Mommy, make this go away," and they can't, which just can be incredibly distressing for parents. Parents have to figure out how to parent both the kid who is sick, and if there are other siblings at home, how to do that, and how to be a parent to both the one in the hospital as well as the kid at home, which is another unique challenge. There is, I referenced the parenting in the fishbowl, which is it's also a really big deal. Parents are in a hospital in probably the worst situation they've ever faced, and they are not at their best. Their kid is not at their best, and there are a ton of eyes on them. And while, for the most part, hospital staff are really supportive and kind, there can also be a lot of opinions about how they're supposed to cope, what they're supposed to do, the proper way to parent. And I can tell you there is no right or wrong way to get through this. There are many different parenting styles and many different ways to be successful, but there's that outside pressure as well. For parents, they have to juggle. There's financial issues and during a time when they are getting, and especially if they have private insurance, their hospital bills are mounting up, and they are likely working less than they did before. Often one parent will take off to be with their kids. Their income has dropped, their expenses have gone up, and it is financial stress in a typical situation is just a highly stressful situation, one of the big ones up there. Then this situation just really makes it challenging. So like kids, parents don't have that shared experience with other parents. You can't just go to your neighbor and be like, "Oh, how did you parent your kid when he was in a roid rage from steroids?" Because they don't have that. It's just a very different experience. Parents who are able to connect with others who have gone through it find it so incredibly valuable to hear validation that they're not bad parents, to have support that, yes, this is a really hard thing to do, to get ideas of what to expect, to just have some of their experiences with their kid and their own internal experiences really normalized. Another thing that can happen with parents is especially in two-parent households, there can be shifts in roles, and that can go smoothly or it can cause a lot of distress. So you may have a family where the mom was taking care of a lot of kid issues, and now all of a sudden mom is stressed out, can't do those as much as she was before, or because she's in the hospital, dad is having to do a lot of home stuff that he didn't have to do before. And sometimes parents navigate this pretty well. Sometimes it causes a lot of fighting. So it's definitely tougher on parents than kids.
So a question that I'm just curious, any perspectives you may have, and if you don't, that's fine too, because I don't certainly have all the answers either. So I'm just looking for any ideas. I really loved what you said about kind of meeting the campers where they are, and not feeling like you have to facilitate, but not shutting down their conversations. I think that that is huge and important. I do worry more and more about staff members who become overwhelmed and need some support, but then the focus needs to be on the campers. Do you have any ideas on how we can meet our staff and volunteers where they are as well, without it becoming about them, but still taking care of them?
Absolutely. I think it's really important for staff to be able to to acknowledge that it can be challenging, but it is rewarding to work with kids who have cancer, and it can also be challenging. When you see a kid who is in pain, it's heartbreaking. When you see a kid vomiting and throwing up or throwing a tantrum because they don't want to, bloody hell tantrum because they don't want to take their medication, it can be very distressing. One of the things that we do in the hospital with nursing staff is to have a bagel hour, and to have that time to sit and talk about what their experiences are like, and to acknowledge that this is hard, and to also acknowledge why you're doing this and the good parts about it also. Really reinforcing that you don't have to choose. You don't have to be all happy or all upset about it. You can experience some distress because you're seeing some difficult things, and kids pull at your heartstrings, and at the exact same time you can experience the joy of being able to give these kids a really important, valuable experience. And those things can exist side by side. I think sometimes when people feel that they have to put on that good face and always be happy, it adds that extra burden. So let's teach them that they can be upset and really excited and engaged at the same time.
Thank you. Is on mute, trying to say thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions, or maybe Ryan was about to say the same thing or has a question? Sorry.
So Karen, obviously we're all on this call to try to learn more about our kids. Are there any sort of publications or studies or something that you can that you find helpful in your profession that would help us throughout the year kind of understand what our kids are going through?
Yes. So I mean, the journals that I read are there's a lot of psycho-oncology journals that a lot of them are technical, but they can have review articles that just talk about different experiences. There is a great organization called APOS, which stands for American, let's see, what is it? American Psycho-Oncology Association. No, a society, American. And this is an organization that is largely attended by psychologists, but it is open to anybody that is working with cancer kids. And slightly different than some of the other organizations, it is really focused on treatment and experience and what kids are going through. So they talk about more applied information. In a my own plug, in a non-cancer specific way, there is a great therapy model that isn't just for therapists, but also for general coaching and helping with psychological distress, called ACT, which is Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. There are lots of workshops out there for coaches and teachers, and I'm sure it would be really appropriate for some camp directors and camp counselors to get a sense about, in general sense, how to help kids with distress.
That's great. Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Saw Diane put AFON in the chat. That's definitely a great resource as well.
I'm sorry, it's Gretchen. I can't use my screen for whatever. So does that group, AFON, they present at ACA or ACN? Do you know? American Camp Nurses Group.
So say that again.
So I didn't know if they ever presented at our nurses, what's the nurses conference? Come on, guys, help me out. You know, the ACN.
Yeah,
right?
Association of Camp Nurses. Yeah, I'm not sure if APON has their own conference.
Okay.
So not sure if they ever cross-pollinate, but maybe we
Right.
should be looking for opportunities for that.
So APOS, which is, I looked it up because I always forget what the acronym stands for. It's the American Psychosocial Oncology Society. So it's focused on the psychosocial aspect of coping with helping individuals with cancer. Somebody put up APOSW, which is the social work society for dealing with pediatric cancer, which is also has lots of great resources. I know APOS and APOSW sometimes cross paths and do things together. I'm sure that they would love to partner up with anything that is going to help our kids.
So AFON's journal is the Journal of Pediatric Hematology Oncology Nurses. So yeah, they have a lot of really good psychosocial stuff in it. And actually Dr. Mike and team just published an article on siblings and camp and some of the research that they did. So that was just in a recent journal. Dr. Mike can probably talk about that a little bit more. I think there are probably some members of AFON who go to ACA and are members of ACN, but you know, we have our own fall conference that is typically well attended by about 1,000 pediatric hematology oncology nurses. So, and just for information's sake, the Association for Camp Nursing just changed their name to Alliance for Camp Health to broaden their scope and open up their membership outside of nursing to mental health professionals, as well as camp directors and things like that. So definitely are trying to broaden their audience a little bit.
I have a question. Do you do anything for siblings in your treatment facility?
So we informally do. We our Child Life will try to reach out to siblings to teach them a little bit about cancer and what their sibling is going to. I am available to provide psychotherapy to any siblings. It doesn't get utilized so much. So in the past, when siblings were allowed to come, they would be part of the group experiences and the group exercises. They've been so isolated. We are in the process of developing some programs, some virtual programs to reach out to siblings, but it's a work in progress.
Well, awesome. So I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Karen, for being here. I know this has been a hot topic and on the top of our minds coming out of COVID, and we really appreciate you helping us understand our campers better. And I know, speaking as a camp director myself, everybody asks, you know, it's easy to kind of describe why camp helps, but we don't know the statistics of how camp helps, and helping us understand our kids better definitely helps put camp in a perspective. So thank you very much.